Marxism and the true cost of the military machine. Karl Marx was a consummate researcher and merciless critic of governmental expenditures. His observations were especially fierce in the face of such widespread human suffering at the hands of the state and the ruling class. In his analyses, Marx never simply pointed out the faults of an institution, but instead provided a scientific and philosophical breakdown of whichever societal structure he set his sights on. This approach provided the foundation for generations of people to not merely tear down faulty structures, but build something better in their place. So naturally, Marx sought to isolate all the ways a governmental body spent its money and dispensed its resources, just as we Marxists should be doing as well. Succinctly put, any expenditures in a world of excess that don't directly contribute to the well-being of the people stands antagonistically to everything we Marxists believe in. The primary culprit of such unrestricted expenditure was then and continues now to be a nation's military. A military, in the sense being used in this piece, is a force built up solely to enforce a nation's will and intentions onto another, presumably sovereign, nation or people. Regardless of the internal circumstances of any nation, be that a society in complete disarray or one on the verge of achieving a utopian society, the spending on its armed capabilities hardly ever stagnates. This is driven by a hedonistic sense of petty nationalism and a desire to see their will imposed on the better part of the world. It's the thinking of any typical supremacist, but one that is unyielding and not prone to peaceful surrender. When a nation dispenses such incredible resources to this venture, there are other interests and needs that go unattended to. These other interests manifest themselves in the form of the subject nation's people. The irony of this, of course, is that the needs of the population are primarily manifested through governmental or societal neglect or oversight. Past a certain point, any amount of this oversight must be derided as purposeful negligence. To fully grasp the impact of such large-scale negligence, it's imperative to understand the cost said neglect has on the individual person and subsequently the whole of society. There is a deeper level of contempt levied at governments that prioritize the strength of the state over the inviolable rights of its people. As said by 18th century philosopher Baron de Montesquieu, it is always the adventurers who do great things, not the sovereigns of great empires. While Marx, a known student of philosophy, might not have studied the particular works of Montesquieu, this quote can still be used to encapsulate the general feeling us Marxists have on the people of the world. The underlying necessity of any serious socialist is a belief in the goodness and potential of every person. A belief that, once freed of oppression, a person can accomplish wonders yet unheard of. Without such a belief, it is easy to fall prey to the cynicism that capitalism forces upon the people. This cynicism guides the majority of critics of socialism when they espouse doubts about the practicality of a socialistic society. A belief, they say, comes from the irrefutable and natural selfishness they see as inherent in every person, to which a socialist should realize and rebut that such selfishness is born of a survival instinct that is perpetuated to this day by capitalism. If a person is no longer preoccupied with the worries of securing shelter, food, and clothing, their mental and physical capabilities would be exponentially improved. These life-threatening preoccupations, it's important to say, can irrefutably be alleviated by a nation capable of spending unheard-of sums of money on its military and overseas expansion. As said earlier, there is a point where a nation's supposed inability to address a societal need must be called out for what it is: purposeful neglect. It becomes increasingly unfathomable for the people to believe a government cannot secure their means of survival when a fraction of the money spent on the quest for international domination could be used to address such needs. This realization leads us to ask just why the state is ignoring our pleas for help. How and why do they continue to claim there are no resources for our salvation, but at the same time endless tools for continued oppression? With this frame of mind, it isn't hard to understand that the people begin to believe the state has transformed, regardless of how noble its origins, into an enemy of liberty and prosperity. A state whose purpose is to keep its citizenry down, or one too preoccupied with personal survival to question or analyze any of the actions of said state. As distinct from the old Gentile order, the state first divides its subjects according to territory. This quote distills the state's means of domination perfectly. By providing the backdrop of a land of scarce resources and fanning the flames of division, the state pits the population against itself to indirectly quell any efforts to unite against that state. This is because the state has the foresight to see that a civilian uprising is inevitable in the face of such unilateral, though unequal, oppression. A foresight, we will see, that only extends so far. In the short term, this produces a docile populace that is predisposed to servitude to an authoritarian force in the natural interest of self-preservation. However, such an evolutionary trend in the social order leads to an eventual collapse of any empire, regardless of its history, longevity, or current global standing. A hollow foundation, in the form of an oppressed population, cannot support an empire bent on never-ending expansion. Expansion that's driven and powered by an ever-growing war machine that threatens to, or outright dominates, neighboring countries into compliance. This prospect of eternal growth is sold to a nation's people by promising wealth, prosperity, and increased freedom for the country and the world over. Whether the people believe this or not often has no bearing on the expansion of a military force by the state. Of course, Karl Marx understood that for every dollar spent on expanding an empire, a dollar was taken from strengthening the existing grounds that said empire stands upon. When this pattern continues without pause, it leads to the inevitable collapse of a nation, as any student of history can attest to. The burden will grow worse and worse as science advances, for the improvements in the art of destruction will keep pace with its advance, and every year, more and more will have to be devoted to costly engines of war. This quote comes from an interview with Marx conducted in 1879 by Monsieur Elphinstone Grant Duff. The account of this interview can be found in a letter Grant Duff wrote to Empress Frederick, the daughter of Queen Victoria. While Marx was not known to be an ardent studier of the military, as that was often a task undertaken by collaborator Friedrich Engels, it is clear that Marx understood just how costly military expansion was. Before continuing, it is important to state that Karl Marx was not against war as a means of achieving political goals. In fact, it could be said that Marx understood that the expansion of a nation's armed capabilities would provide the proletariat with the tools to overthrow their oppressors, i.e. the state. Much in the way capitalism bred innovations that would make capitalism itself obsolete, the citizenry would, one day, take hold of the tools produced by a militaristic state and thus be equipped to liberate itself. We saw this famously in the Russian Revolution of 1917, when the Romanov dynasty, then headed by Nikolai II, was overthrown by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party with the help of disaffected members of the Russian military. While the lens of Marxism is often that of class conflict, or the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, we cannot ignore the role that the state plays in maintaining this base class antagonism. As written by Friedrich Engels in 1877, the state is, quote, an organization of the particular exploiting class for the maintenance of its external conditions of production, and therefore especially for the purpose of forcibly keeping the exploited class in the conditions of oppression determined by the given mode of production. In essence, Engels says here that the state, being a mechanism born of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms, exists solely to maintain the existing order in which the bourgeoisie actively represses the revolutionary spirit of the proletariat. It is in the direct interest of the ruling class, having control over our politics, to compel the state to keep the uneasy masses downtrodden or too weak to accomplish any sort of overthrow of the existing order. How the state accomplishes this is of little concern to the bourgeoisie, so long as the implemented methods do not interfere with the flow of capital and the growth of profits. Expanding a military force is one such method to which the ruling class raises no objection. It should also be pointed out that the expansion of a military force also coincides with an increase in domestic policing and advanced arms to law enforcement. As written in The State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin, quote, a standing army and police are the chief instruments of state power. It is the state that employs, arms, and orders the police, National Guard, and military in its quest for domestic and international domination. What the state and its rulers seem to underestimate is the citizens' ability to revolt with the tools of the state if and when their needs are not met. Again, this is done with the help of the government having the tools ready to quell any civilian unrest. The creation of these tools of oppression forms a paradox in which the state simultaneously introduces the same tools needed for a proletarian revolution. The state confuses national unrest and voicing discontent with a general hatred of the state. This, of course, can be true, depending on how long the oppressed have gone without reprieve. Though, instead of seeking to address the grievances of the population, they further fund the tools of oppression and thus see an intensification of the previously highlighted paradox. It is a horrible, continuous cycle of societal decline we find ourselves in as the ruling class clamps down on the citizens, which only proliferates the struggles of the revolting class. In failing to negotiate with the people regarding the spending of state resources, we end up seeing the withering away of faith in the state. In response, the state mercilessly crushes dissent to maintain the existing order. This only works to exacerbate the plights of the working class, while the ruling class expands its empires out around the world, subjecting a larger percentage of the world's population to its despotic rule. War is a method deployed by the state to expand the markets for the capitalists out around the globe. These two separate but related crises collide in wartime when a government spends taxpayer money on for-profit weapon manufacturers instead of resources for the struggling people of the home country. A stark contradiction when war itself is sold to the masses as a way to increase the quality of life for the empire's citizens. Marx and Engels, never short-sighted in their analyses, understood war-related activities not as a singular cause for societal strife, but as an inevitable symptom of perpetual capitalistic growth. Vladimir Lenin, possibly the most influential student of classical Marxism, further expounded on the paradox that military and domestic police expansion causes. The bureaucracy and the standing army are a parasite on the body of bourgeois society. A parasite created by the internal antagonisms which rend that society, but a parasite which chokes all its vital pores. The vital pores Lenin references are the necessary foundations on which an expanding empire needs to reinforce before setting out to accomplish said expansion. The way in which this parasite chokes these pores is with the improper allocation of governmental resources, which we can primarily place the blame at the feet of the military complex. This blame grows increasingly more widespread and becomes commonplace in the public's political discourse as this contradiction continues unabridged. But the more the bureaucratic apparatus is redistributed among the various bourgeois and petty bourgeois parties, the more keenly aware the oppressed classes and the proletariat in their head become of the irreconcilable hostility to the whole of bourgeois society. Hence the need for all bourgeois parties, even the most democratic and revolutionary democratic among them, to intensify repressive measures against the revolutionary proletariat, to strengthen the apparatus of coercion, i.e. the state machine. It cannot be put more bluntly than that. No governmental body, party, or representative that serves the interest of capital can be trusted to put the interest of the revolutionary population at the forefront. It's in this repulsive loop that we have lived through for the better part of the past 200 years. There are motives beyond simple patriotism or nobility that drives governments to war. Patriotism and perceived moral superiority is only used to compel the citizens to support a war. But beneath that veil and below the guise of spreading and protecting democracy, we find a motive much more clear-cut and cold. That of expanding profits for the few of a nation. The necessary framework and aforementioned calamities posited within this fit perfectly over a historical study of the past 100 years of the United States Empire. A steady shift in priorities of the US government has heavily swayed toward global domination and expansion. In times of war, it is expected that a country increases its military spending. The problem arises when the government of said nation siphons resources from social programs to fund the war machine, while frivolously declaring wars and conflicts with other nations. We really begin to see the consistent rise in military spending compiled with the diminishing of community resources during and in the decades following World War II. The people of the United States have been conditioned to accept the government's dwindling interest in the well-being of the population as simply being too costly a venture. This has been achieved through a methodical indoctrination campaign that deploys propaganda upon the population, Legendary American civil rights activist Malcolm X warned followers of his of the dangers and effectiveness of propaganda with the following quote: "If you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people oppressed and loving the people doing the oppressing." Specifically speaking on the media's role in disseminating state propaganda, with the word newspaper being a stand-in for the media, Malcolm X summarizes one of the end goals of effective propaganda. Of course, the news media is just one of the many tools of dissemination. These state-approved works comprise of imagery and anecdotes of faraway foreign threats to their safety and freedoms. An ever-present specter that stands opposed to all their values and beliefs, be that foreign or domestic. One that can only be crushed by the brave men and women of the armed forces and the police of the United States. By diverting the attention of the country's people to some vague threat, they grow increasingly unaware of the plethora of issues within their own borders. Whatever regime is in power in the United States, regardless of party, continued the rise in defense spending and the gradual depletion of resources for domestic social programs. The point of no return came with the beginning of the Cold War, or the global battle between capitalism and communism. The United States, being the self-appointed champion of capitalism, directed incredible amounts of money and manpower to stopping the spread of communism. The cost and immediate loss of life manifests itself in the form of CIA-backed coups, forceful domination in developing countries for natural resources, and establishment of hundreds of military bases internationally. The vocal disavowalment of communist countries is delivered simultaneously with praises of capitalism and the United States. This is so that the public's perception of America and its institutions is always in comparison to another country. As famed screenwriter and activist Dalton Trumbo wrote, quote, "With hatred of their society the only patriotic measure of devotion to our own, action gives way to reaction and initiative trails off to mere response." Dalton Trumbo rightly chastised the ineffectual platitudes pumped out by our elected officials to a suffering people. He and other active members of the Communist Party of the United States worked diligently to fight back draconian laws inhibiting free thought and speech. They understood that in times of mass suffering, the appeal of communism grows. The United States government, though their foresight was limited, similarly acknowledged such a reality. It is in the Congressional Record, dated June 1st, 1949 to June 27th, 1949, that you will find this statement from an unnamed congressman present. Quote, "The slums of America are breeding spots of communism." End quote. The elected officials see the plights of the working class, yet easing the burden of the people would stand in the way of growing profits for the capitalist class. Those in charge never seek to find out what material conditions lead people to adopt a liking to communism or socialism. Instead, they increase the tools of oppression and funnel our tax dollars to the upper class. The elected politicians pull the levers of government and thus control where the resources are directed. The unquantifiable sums of money wasted in purposeful acts of repression is enough to bring any working class citizen to a point where they see revolution as the only viable means of salvation. That is, of course, if the downtrodden proletariat lift their heads long enough to see past the information fed to them by the state. Their obsession with competing with the achievements of the Soviet Union set the United States on an irreversible path towards internal collapse. A prime example is the US's involvement and commitment to the space race of the 1960s. This spacefaring national effort cost obscene amounts of money, and much of it was diverted from publicly funded rehab facilities, mental health centers, and basic infrastructure. The gutting of the funding of these programs has had intense repercussions for the American people. The state simultaneously criminalized drug use so that addicts were thrown in prisons instead of getting treated for the diseases they had, privatized healthcare facilities so that those who need care the most couldn't afford it, and ignored the structural integrity of roads, bridges, and schools, which has directly killed countless people from regular collapses and general rot. This, of course, is an extreme oversimplification of the dire effects the US's ignorance has caused. The larger point still stands true, that the US government, in their thirst for world domination, routinely neglects the home front at the expense of the nation's most vulnerable. There is a phrase used earlier that is important to call back to: unequal but unilateral oppression. This is a way of framing the individual struggles of working class people while not discounting the statistically proven increased struggles marginalized people face. It is a settled fact by extensive research and historical evidence that the struggles and challenges faced by a cisgendered, heterosexual white male are not equal to those of, say, a transsexual African American. The primary reason so many react adversely to hearing of the particular struggles of a marginalized community is because they are afraid that their needs will go unattended to in seeking to address the needs of the marginalized. What is an inevitable product of capitalism, that of general and increasing levels of suffering of the working class, can vary in intensity. Communicating this to a single person is where our task lies. As we in the Communist Party seek to unify the working class, it is imperative that we offer sympathy equal to the levels that we try to educate the masses. When discussing the shortcomings of the government's response to human suffering, it is essential to point out that every working class person is a victim of the actions and inactions of this capitalist regime. To do so requires balance and patience, but pointing out the objective misallocations of governmental resources is a way to maneuver past an individual's personal inclination towards self-preservation, and thus widen their view to the whole of the systemic issues at hand. Such a narrow worldview is again a product of the survival instinct perpetuated by capitalism. Hear the individual's grievances, many of which are valid and widely shared, and ask them what they wish the government would do to alleviate their burdens. Their response to this question is almost inconsequential, as we, students of Marxism and studiers of governmental expenditures, know that the resources necessary for humanity's salvation are already in the possession of the state. The challenge arises in broadening the view of the individual past their personal struggle for survival and onto a larger understanding of the government's failure in protecting all of their people. With a scientific and factual dissection of the US government's spending on its military and other such expenditures, we can achieve this. It is crucial to understand the structural layout of such a despotic and abusive government if we are to discuss how to dismantle it. The situation in the United States has more than a few similarities to pre-revolutionary China of the 1920s and 1930s. Writings of Mao Zedong are as pertinent here in America as they ever have been. Parallels can be drawn between the grievances of the Chinese peasantry of the 1920s and the plights of the American working class of 2022. Studying Mao's writings and the trajectory of the Chinese Revolution will lend a great deal of valuable insight to members of the American Communist Party. As Mao Zedong put it when dissecting the machinations of state power, quote, "Then the capitalists have parliaments to pass laws protecting the capitalist and handicapping the proletariat. They have governments to apply these laws and to enforce the advantages and prohibitions that they contain. They have armies and police to defend the well-being of the capitalist and to repress the demands of the proletariat." The tools of the bourgeoisie present in pre-revolution China were identical to the ones still deployed here in America today. It is precisely because of this that we must acknowledge these similarities and learn from those who led the masses through similar struggles, both inside and outside of China. To understand that the current ruling class has no intention of loosening their grip on the people, their freedom, or their inner potential, is to understand that there is no path to freedom that does not include revolution. Revolution requires the full participation and enthusiasm of the masses. This is the advantage the Communist Party has over all other political organizations. We are a movement built on unity and solidarity. Channeling this attitude is of the utmost importance in our struggle today to promote revolution and the liberation of the masses. We, as the class-conscious party, must stand as the inspiring vanguard to the proletariat in these unprecedented times. Through discovery of commonalities among the immensely divided working class, promoting thorough and objective analyses of current situations, to general education and targeted agitation can we bring about the climax of these revolutionary times. It takes patience, empathy, and hard work, but these are traits found in abundance in the Communist Party. In his writing titled Report on an Investigation of the Peasant Movement in Hunan, Mao Zedong wrote, "The most violent revolts and the most serious disorders have invariably occurred in places where the local tyrants, evil gentry, and lawless landlords have perpetuated the worst outrages." It is important to state that the Communist Party does not call for violence in the people's fight for liberation, but does not stand opposed to it either. We in the party understand that only so much oppression and domination will be tolerated before an eruption takes place. This eruption can take shape in the form of shocking electoral results, a massive and lively demonstration, or bouts of violence from a desperate population. Regardless of the shape such an uprising takes, the party should stand ready to seize the moment and guide the revolting masses accurately, as to not waste the opportunities before us. Focusing on the reckless and unchecked spending of government money will lead us to audiences not beholden to one of the two major political parties in the United States. This is an issue that the ill-treated masses can find common ground on. Our analysis should be thorough, factual, and objective when presenting the case to the people. Bringing this discussion to the masses will inevitably lead them to the question of, if we spend money on this, why can't we spend it on something more beneficial to the people? I will leave you all with a line from the oft-quoted Art of War, authored by Sun Tzu. "There is no instance of a nation benefiting from prolonged warfare. War does nothing but kill and destroy civilizations, both directly through physical violence and indirectly from governmental negligence. We must make this clear to the people so that we may, collectively, demand a stop to the senseless and cruel suffering that is caused by the continuous expansion of the military machine." Thank you all so very much for watching my first video essay. This really was a labor of love, extra emphasis on the word labor. This was a lot, honestly. I had a lot going on in real life, which is what also delayed the production of this, but it was also a lot of work that I didn't anticipate, to be quite honest with you. And though compared to other video essays on YouTube, this may seem like a kindergartner's project, it still took a lot out of me, and I'm moderately happy with the final result. Of course, my vision was not quite translated to the final product, but I'll leave it at that. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed making it for as much work as it took, and depending on your reaction to my video, you may be relieved or upset to hear it's going to take a long time to get my next video essay up and posted. But in the meantime, I'm going to go back to my regular posting of just quick educational, historical videos and whatnot, and leave the writing and video essays as like a side project. But all that said and done, thanks for tuning in. Do the usual, subscribe and comment and all that business. Follow me on Twitter. And yeah, I'll catch you on the next one, alright? Take care of yourselves. Peace.